Now, we're not actually an insurance company, Lloyds of London. We're an insurance market. We're the largest insurance market in the world. We're actually the only insurance market in the world. If you want to insure a very unusual risk, you come into the Lloyds market, you go to one underwriter to get a bit of a policy, go to another underwriter to get another bit of the policy, put them together, and you have a policy that will cover the risk that you're wanting to insure. Now, inside the Lloyds marketplace, we actually have 50 companies operating. Companies that are corporate entities in their own right, that are either listed on the London Stock Exchange or quite often are a subsidiary of an overseas entity such as a Liberty in Boston or an Ace in Bermuda or whatever. But we've got these 50 companies operating inside the Lloyds marketplace with their underwriters actually sitting inside the Lloyds building. So it is a market. We have over 5,000 brokers wandering into our building every day with suitcases like this one sometimes, actually, my only prop for today, full of information about a risk that they might want to actually cover. And you say, why would you need so much information? Well, you need so much information because the risks that we cover are so complex. So, for instance, I have been sitting on a box where the underwriter was covering the Sultan of Oman's private fleet of aircraft. He's got a few 777s, a few 747s, a few Gulfstreams, etc. And to actually cover that risk, the underwriter wanted to know the age of every aeroplane, where it was serviced, the destinations that the aeroplane would go to, the surface of the runways. Then he wanted to know about the crew and the age of the crew and where they were trained. And it was an enormous amount of information the underwriter actually required to be able to underwrite that risk. When the underwriters actually write an insurance policy, however, what they issue is a Lloyds policy. And that is quite a unique structure. We're a mutual market. And so anyone operating inside the Lloyds marketplace, even though they might work for their own company, they will work for their own company, the policy they issue is a Lloyds policy, and therefore it has Lloyds security behind it. And Lloyds security is very important because we have never defaulted on a claim. We've paid all our claims in the 321 years that we've been operating. That has been a challenge for us because in certain periods in our history, it's been quite difficult to find the funds to pay those claims, and I'll share some of those experiences with you. What sort of things do we insure, apart from, what was her name, Dion's vocal cords? Ugly Betty's smile. Have you seen Ugly Betty on television? Well, we cover her smile. For the older people in the audience, Betty Grable's legs. We've insured her legs. We actually do a lot of legs. American footballers' legs, European soccer players' kneecaps, so Beckham's kneecaps, Ronaldo's kneecaps. So we do a lot of body parts. Someone's chest hair. We actually insured their chest hair. I don't know what the claim would have looked like on that chest hair claim, but give you some oddities. We've insured a coffee taster's tongue for $5 million, and we've insured a wine taster's nose for tulip wines for $10 million. That's the odd stuff. But it is important because, frankly, if you are an American football player and you break your leg and you're unable to play again, you've got faced with loss of earnings, you're faced with rehabilitation. And so the insurance policy is very important because that kicks in to start to enable that person to get back into training or whatever and rehabilitate and, if necessary, pay for loss of earnings. So these are quite important policies. But we also do other stuff. I mean, we were the first insurer to offer insurance for aviation. 1911 was the first commercial flight, and we insured that flight. We also insured the first commercial space flight in 2004. We insure oil rigs, we insure bridges, we insure buildings, we insure workers comp, we provide D&O cover, directors and officers liability, we provide terrorism cover, we insure against political risk, a very large and varied range of activities that we get involved in. Basically, I suppose what we do is insure things other people can't or won't insure. And I'd just like to share with you two crises that Lloyds has weathered, two storms that Lloyds has weathered, that are very relevant, very pertinent to the economic crisis that we find ourselves faced with today. They're quite well documented, but let me spend a few minutes just sharing them with you. The first crisis we had to weather was back in the 90s. And in the middle of the 90s, so around about 93, 94, Lloyds suddenly found itself faced with enormous losses. We were faced with 34,000 people who invested in Lloyds and were faced with ruinous claims that they were having to pay, these $15 billion worth of claims as a result of the problems that we'd found ourselves faced with. So it was an extraordinary period in our history. Where were these $15 billion worth of claims coming from? A variety of things. We were faced with a bit of a perfect storm. Asbestos. I'm sure you're all familiar with asbestos, asbestosis. Lloyds wrote a lot of the policies here in the US back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, providing cover to workers for asbestos. The problem we faced, though, is we wrote those policies in the 60s and the claims didn't come through until the 80s and 90s. How can you write a risk? How can you price a risk in the 60s where you don't pay out the claim until the 90s? Pricing was completely shot to pieces. So the claims coming from asbestos were far greater than any of the premiums we'd ever taken in for those policies. And it wasn't just asbestos. We were also faced with claims coming from Piper Alpha, an oil rig that exploded, Exxon Valdez that leaked oil up in Alaska, Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and probably quite a few other things. Lead paint. We were having to deal with the environmental problem of lead paint and lead paint poisoning people. How we dealt with that problem in the 90s was very simple. It required a lot of effort, but ultimately it was a simple solution. And the solution was really sort of based on the good bank, bad bank model. And we took the decision, along with the support of government, to take all those liabilities, that $15 billion worth of claims, put all the assets we had against those liabilities and put them off into a completely separate vehicle, and that vehicle was called Equitas. So we sold the building, we sold Lloyd's List, a publisher, we sold Lloyd's Register, we sold absolutely everything, except for the silver. If you come into the Lloyd's building today, you'll still see we kept the silver. That's the one thing we kept. But we sold everything to put it into this vehicle called Equitas, so we had some assets that we could put against those liabilities. Now, you would have thought we would have learnt from that experience, said, let's do things a little bit differently. The only thing that we did differently going forward was to move from an unlimited liability basis to a limited liability basis. Prior to this issue, anyone participating in Lloyd's providing capital would do it on an unlimited liability basis. So if you had a claim, you paid it. And if the claim just grew and grew, you continued to pay and pay. And what happened to these 34,000 people that were providing capital? They were faced with ruin and a lot of suicides and the such like as a result of having to meet those liabilities. So we took the decision to say, right, stop, no more unlimited liability. You can only write on a limited liability basis. But we didn't change anything else. I'm sure you've heard that story before when you look at what the banks are doing at the moment. Nothing else changed. So, of course, we were then faced with our second storm, and that storm happened in 2001, the tragic events of the World Trade Center, where we found ourselves being the largest insurer of the World Trade Center. And we ended up with liabilities, claims coming out of the World Trade Center of $11 billion out of the total $40 billion claim. So less than 8 years later, one day after the World Trade Center, sitting in a room, 24 hours after the event, you had the same people sitting there saying, we're about to go bankrupt. We can't pay this $11 billion. Quite extraordinary that so soon after the problems of the 90s, we were faced with a similar problem. The problem we had with the World Trade Center was a simple liquidity problem, a funding problem. The US authorities wanted us to fund our liabilities gross here in the US, and we didn't have the cash. And so we had to scrabble around, strike a few deals, and finally we were able to come to an arrangement whereby we would cut a little bit of slack, a few days here and there, and we're able to then find the cash to fund those liabilities from the World Trade Center. Lloyd said, hold on, we're going to have to completely overhaul the way this market is operated. And so we changed management of businesses, we changed the governance of Lloyd's, and we put in a completely new structure. And the structure we put in, I would call it the McDonald's of Lloyd's. We put in a franchise structure, very similar to McDonald's. There's nothing new in this world. You know, if you go to the McDonald's in Tokyo and ask for a Big Mac and large fries, you know what's exactly going to be in that Big Mac, where the gherkin's going to be, and how many fries you're going to get in your bucket of fries. Just as if you go to a McDonald's here in Philadelphia and ask for a Big Mac and fries, you'll get exactly the same. So, what's his name? Ronald McDonald? He's able to impose standards across the whole of the McDonald's franchise and get everyone to do the same thing. And that's exactly what we had to do in Lloyds. We said, right, we're going to operate a franchise model whereby anyone who wants to write business inside the Lloyds market does it according to the standards we set. And they have to meet those standards. And the standards are very clearly around risk management and around capital setting. If I talk about risk management, because that was the real lesson that we learned from the World Trade Center, we've now introduced a very structured and disciplined approach to the risks that businesses are allowed to write in the Lloyds marketplace. So we look at two things. So if you're company A that is writing risks inside Lloyds, we look at the risks that you're writing, and then we look at how your risks plus everyone else's risks adds up together what the aggregate exposure is, to ensure that firstly the capital you have is sufficient to support your business, but secondly that the capital the market has is sufficient to support the risks across the whole market. So it's a very disciplined approach to risk management, and it's a very disciplined approach to capital setting. We have other standards around claims, around business processing and the such like, but the imposition of standards on our market has been a life-changing experience for us. And the use of a very disciplined risk management approach linked in with capital setting has been life-changing for us. How life-changing? Well, 2001 was the World Trade Center, 2005, Katrina Rita Wilma, bigger than the World Trade Center. The losses from the World Trade Center were $40 billion. The losses from Katrina Rita Wilma were $60 billion. And our share of Katrina Rita Wilma was $16 billion. Just to remind you, our share of the World Trade Center was $11 billion. When we had the World Trade Center and we looked at the results for the market at the end of the year, the market loss in total was $5 billion, which is why we were close to bankrupt. Coming out of 2005, I took over in 2006, just on the back of paying out $16 billion for Katrina Rita Wilma, and the loss for the overall market was $160 million. So it was a complete reversal in fortunes, and that was a direct result of our approach to risk management. That's the sort of potted history of Lloyds and where we've got to. How is that serving us in today's crisis? Because we seem to have a lot of crises literally every 3 or 4 years in the Lloyds market. And the most recent one, yes, is the subprime crisis, the recession, the economic crisis that we now found ourselves in 2009. Well, as a result of all the changes that we have instigated over recent years, we've actually weathered the recent storm pretty well. I'm reminded when talking about the recent storm of AIG, I'm not here to knock a government-owned competitor, uncomfortable though it may be to have a competitor that's owned by the government. But when talking to someone about AIG, they said to me, the problem with AIG is when you look at their balance sheet, on the left side of the balance sheet, nothing is right, and on the right side of the balance sheet, nothing is left. Okay? That was, yeah, you're absolutely right. We must never mix up both sides of the balance sheet. So the way we Lloyds have weathered the storm is to keep the two separate. And by the two separate, I mean the liabilities, the risks we write, we keep in one bucket and manage those. And the assets, the capital that we have to offset against those risks, we keep in a completely separate bucket. Now, the assets we have in the Lloyds market, roughly $60 billion at the moment, to support the risks that we write, to support the $33 billion worth of premium that we write every year. That $60 billion we manage very, very conservatively. So over the past 2 years, our exposure to equities and exotic instruments and structured products has been less than 5%. So looking at our $60 billion, we've got roughly a third in corporate bonds, third in government bonds, and a third in cash. What that means is we don't make spectacular returns from our assets, but we also don't make spectacular losses. And that's very important because those assets are there to support the liabilities, where we do want to take risk. So we don't take risks with our assets, and we do take risks on the liability side. But when taking risk on the liability side, we're actually now quite selective. And when we don't like a risk, we don't write it. And that also is a very important lesson. If you don't like the risk, you don't like the business, don't do it. And particularly if you don't understand it, certainly don't do it. So in the past, in Lloyds, we used to write a lot of financial institution business. And we provided a lot of cover to two great names, Enron and WorldCom. And as a result of that, we paid out some pretty large claims. But also as a result of that, we took a conscious decision to scale back our exposure to financial institutions because we were just uncomfortable with that type of risk. We didn't really understand it that well. So if you don't understand it that well, don't do it. So we scaled it right back to the extent that now with the subprime problem, with the Madoff problem, with the Stanford problem, we find very little exposure to those institutions, those organizations, and also to subprime claims. So all the problems arising out of the financial crisis, we will be able to deal with as business as usual. So it's quite an important lesson for us. Don't mix up assets and liabilities. Be selective on your risks. And when you don't understand it, you don't like it, just don't do it, walk away.